Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on Lafayette in America, 1777 to 81, and 1824-25. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norris Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. We offer a special thank you to Andrea Vinci, recreational therapist. These programs mean a lot to our fellow veterans who are watching, and Andrea makes these programs possible. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Alan Hoffman. Alan Hoffman earned a BA from Yale and a JD from Harvard Law School. He practiced law in Boston for 50 years. An avid reader of early American history, his translation of Lafayette in America, first published in 2006, is now in its third printing. He has given more than 200 talks on Lafayette, and he has spoken in every state and Washington, D.C. that Lafayette visited during his farewell tour. Copies of the book signed by Alan Hoffman are available for sale here at the library. Please welcome Alan Hoffman.
I just wanted to add something about a line from Hamilton.
Oh, jeez.
Everybody give it up for America's fighting favorite Frenchman.
Favorite fighter.
Favorite fighting Frenchman. Lafayette.
Well, a pleasure to be here in this wonderful cradle of the American Revolution and our freedom. I'm going to tell you about two phases, probably the two most significant phases of Lafayette's life: his role in the American Revolution and his return visit in 1824 and 1825 when he came back as an elder statesman and wowed the country. We'll go back to the beginning. Lafayette was born in the Auvergne region in 1757. The first slide is an image of Lafayette's ancestral chateau. You might have to move a little closer.
Just sit here.
Yeah, let's see if it works.
Is it on? Oh, yeah. Oh, I need to turn it on.
Well, why don't you sit closer, Jim? Maybe that will do it. The reason I asked him to do it is because I always screw it up when I do it. I never like to do it myself.
I could stand here and do it.
Let me try to replace the battery.
Ah,
Sorry.
You know, I worked before. Would you,
I know. I don't know. Here, I think there's just.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, in the meantime,
Yeah. Well, at least we know the microphone works.
good. Nice, quick response.
There we go.
That
Okay.
works.
All right.
Amazing.
So anyhow, thank you. That is the ancestral chateau called Chavignac. It's in the Auvergne region of France. Having inherited a prestigious title and great wealth upon the early death of his father in the 7 Years' War, and also later his mother and maternal grandfather, Lafayette traveled to America in 1777 to join our revolution on a ship purchased and provisioned with his own funds. He was one of the richest men in France at that time, carrying with him a commission in the Continental Army, making him a major general. At the time, he was 19 years old and a captain in the French army on furlough. He was introduced to General George Washington at a tavern in Philadelphia on July 31, 1777, and invited to join his staff and to serve initially as a volunteer without a command. His charm and what we would call today his winning personality quickly won Washington's friendship. In his memoir, Lafayette recounts this anecdote. On the day of Lafayette's arrival in camp, some miles from Philadelphia, on August 8, General Washington was reviewing his 11,000 ill-armed and worse-clad troops. He remarked to Lafayette, "We must feel embarrassed to exhibit ourselves before an officer who has just left French troops." Lafayette replied, "I come to learn, not to teach." And that modest tone, he continues in his memoir, which was not common in Europeans, produced a very good effect. His baptism by fire took place on September 11, 1777, 5 days after his 20th birthday, at the Battle of the Brandywine, which was part of the British Army's successful campaign to take the capital, Philadelphia. Now, the next slide is a map, and the important part is the blue troops are the Continentals, and you see that red line going over, up and around. Well, that was a flanking action by Lord Cornwallis that surprised the Americans. We had very dubious intelligence, and Washington was totally surprised. So as a result of that, the battle was turning into a rout. Lafayette, a volunteer major general without a command, obtained permission to join the fray. He galloped forward, drew his sword, and successfully urged the troops to cease their retreat and turn and face the enemy. He was shot in the left leg, and when his boot filled with blood, he was carried off the field. But he was given some credit for turning the tide and leading to a successful retreat. The next slide is an engraving of Lafayette wounded at Brandywine. As Lafayette told a reporter in an interview with Paulson's Advertiser in 1825 during the farewell tour, he was taken to a farmhouse in Chester and placed upon a dining table while the doctors worked on his leg. Just then, a group of American officers burst in. Lafayette looked up and said in his broken English, "Gentlemen, you look hungry. I hope you don't think I'm dinner." He had a wonderful sense of humor. Recuperating with the Moravian community in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Lafayette missed the Battle of Germantown, but he rejoined the army and was sent on a reconnaissance mission in Gloucester, New Jersey on November 24, 1777. There he attacked a column of Hessian soldiers, caused them to retreat, and took some prisoners and returned to camp. Both General Nathaniel Greene and General Washington were duly impressed, especially as in his reports, Lafayette gave all the credit to his soldiers. By November of 1777, Washington was so impressed with the young man's courage, prudence in war councils, and character that he petitioned the Continental Army to give him a field command, which was not Washington's initial intent. By December 19, 1777, when the Army entered its winter quarters at Valley Forge, Congress had approved, and Washington put Lafayette in charge of a division of 3,000 troops, which was not an insignificant part of the entire Continental Army at that time. The next slide is Lafayette and Washington, or Washington and Lafayette, I should say, at Valley Forge. The year 1778 was full of action for the young Major General. In February, the War Board, the reigning civilian authority, sent Lafayette north to invade Canada against the wishes of Washington. When he arrived in the Albany area, he found troops ill-fed, ill-clad, unpaid, and short of ammunition. So he called the invasion off. While there, though, he traveled to the settlements of the Oneida Nation, America's loyal ally in the war, assisted them with fortifications, and recruited 47 Oneida warriors for the Continental Army, who joined his division at Valley Forge. Shortly after Lafayette's return to Valley Forge in April, news of the treaty alliance that had been signed on February 6, 1778, the alliance with France, boosted the morale of the entire Continental Army. On May 18th, Washington sent Lafayette with 2,200 troops, including the Oneidas, to find out what the British were doing in Philadelphia. Loyalist informers alerted the British, who surrounded Lafayette's army with a force of 16,000 British troops. At Barron Hill, Pennsylvania, now called Lafayette Hill, Lafayette made his greatest escape, returning to Valley Forge with only modest casualties. 6 Oneida died and are honored by a stone marker in a church in Lafayette Hill. The British, learning that the French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing was sailing to America, evacuated Philadelphia and headed for New York City on June 18. It was decided in a war council to attack. General Charles Lee, a senior general who had served in the British Army, opposed the decision. Therefore, Washington assigned Lafayette to lead the attack. However, when Lee asked for his command, as he was entitled to by seniority, Lafayette stepped aside. On that brutally hot day, there were more soldiers died from the heat than from wounds. As Lin-Manuel Miranda tells in the music Hamilton, Lee ordered a hasty retreat. Washington, after hurling obscenities at General Lee, took over the command himself and preserved a draw. The arrival of the French squadron on July 8 led to the Rhode Island campaign in August of 1778. During this campaign, Lafayette and his troops, and the troops that he and General Greene had brought from the American encampments at White Plains, New York, to support the invasion of Aquidneck Island, actually reached the ramparts of Newport. Now, the next slide is just an overall map. Aquidneck Island is 3 towns. It's Portsmouth, Middletown, and Newport. And you see down below on the bottom, they had actually reached the Newport part. But then what happened was the British fleet was coming up on a rescue mission from New York, and the French fleet, which had arrived and was supporting the invasion, went into Rhode Island Sound to engage with the British. The next slide shows the French fleet near Newport, but they went into the Sound. There was a hurricane or a nor'easter. Both fleets were battered and damaged, and the French, as the Count d'Estaing had been told to do, if something like that ever happened, he should go back to Boston for repairs, which he did. Lafayette was assigned to ride to Boston, which he did, to try to persuade his cousin, the Count d'Estaing, another Auvergnat, to return at least a part of the fleet. Although he did not succeed in this endeavor, and the Americans had to retreat and evacuate, he played an important role in preserving the French alliance, which had been recently finalized, which was jeopardized because General Sullivan, a hot-headed New Hampshire attorney who later became governor, issued orders accusing the Count d'Estaing of leaving the scene of an invasion. It almost created an international incident. In any event, Lafayette returned to Rhode Island and helped with the evacuation to Tiverton at the narrowest point. It's called Howland's Ferry. And for his role in that battle, he was given a congressional commendation. Lafayette returned to France on furlough on the frigate Alliance on January 11, 1779. The next slide is a portrait from life, perhaps the best image of him during this period, by Charles Wilson Peale. He was considered a hero of 2 worlds. He was also considered the expert on the cause of the insurgents, as the French called the American revolutionaries, and France had now fully embraced the cause. While in France, he lobbied for more money, material, and ammunition, and most importantly, for a French land force. The memorandum that he wrote to the ministers in July of 1779 became a plan of action for France to pull the Americans over the finish line in the war. One historian titles the chapter in which he discusses that memorandum, quote, Lafayette to the rescue. It is certainly fair to say that Lafayette and Ambassador Benjamin Franklin were most responsible for the decision made by the French court to provide this aid in 1780. On March 17, 1780, Lafayette sailed back to America aboard the Hermione, a new modern design frigate, to tell his paternal friend Washington that help was on the way. The next slide is a detail from a French painting in the 1780s showing the Hermione, and the next slide is the replica ship that came up the eastern seaboard in 2015, built from the wood from the same forest and at the same shipbuilding town, Rochefort, that the original was built. Lafayette disembarked from the Hermione in Boston on April 28th at Hancock's Wharf, now called Lewis Wharf, and spent several days in Boston before traveling to Morristown, New Jersey by land, where he imparted the news to Washington on May 10th. The news that the French expeditionary force under General Rochambeau would be dispatched to American shores. Rochambeau arrived with his 5,000-man army and squadron of ships in July of 1780 at Newport, which the British had by then evacuated. The arrival of the French expeditionary force was Lafayette's greatest diplomatic triumph in the American Revolution, his greatest military contribution to the American cause in the campaign in 1781. Charged with defending Virginia and capturing Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general serving in Virginia, Lafayette arrived in Virginia in March with 1,200 Continentals and began his cat and mouse game with Lord Cornwallis, the same general who had tricked the army at Brandywine, who had arrived in May to take over British forces in Virginia, and he dispatched Arnold back to New York. Lafayette was badly outmanned, having less than half of Cornwallis's 75-man force, even including the Virginia militia, until General Anthony Wayne arrived with an additional 1,000 Continentals on June 10. At that point, Lafayette stepped up his pursuit of Cornwallis as he headed for a deep water port under instructions from his commander-in-chief, General Clinton. On July 6, 1781, near the Green Spring Plantation in Jamestown, disaster nearly struck. Following Cornwallis's tracks as the British general led his troops from Williamsburg across the James River on the way to Portsmouth, Lafayette and Wayne decided to attack the British rear guard after the bulk of the Redcoat Army had crossed the river. Cornwallis, however, decided to spring a trap. He sequestered a large part of the army, hidden from view about a mile from the American posse. As Wayne was about to lead 800 men against what he thought was the rear guard of the British force, Lafayette smelled a rat, and reconnoitering, he saw that the main body of the British army was still on the near side of the James. He rode furiously to warn Mad Anthony Wayne, as he was called, but it was too late. Wayne, seeing a tidal wave of redcoats, did what only a madman would do. He ordered his men, bayonets drawn, to head straight for the red wave. The British were stunned and hesitated to press their advantage. Meanwhile, Lafayette galloped into the fray with 500 additional troops, and the two generals managed an orderly retreat with only modest casualties. As Lafayette wrote to his brother-in-law, the Viscount de Noailles, who was with Rochambeau's army at the time, on July 9, this devil Cornwallis is much wiser than the other generals with whom I have dealt. He inspires me with a sincere fear, and his name greatly troubled my sleep. This campaign is a good school for me. God grant the public does not pay for my lessons. Then, in what seems like an aside, he continued, my fine horse was killed under my groom. Having received intelligence from an enslaved man who was a spy in Cornwallis's camp that the British had begun fortifying at York, as Lafayette wrote Washington on August 25th, Lafayette continued his pursuit of Cornwallis, setting up camp in Williamsburg in early September. In the meantime, the French West Indian fleet under the Comte de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake in late August, and in early September landed 3,000 men, 3,000 troops under Saint-Simon. With this influx, Lafayette finally had a force equal in numbers to the British force at Yorktown. The Battle of the Capes, one of the most important naval battles in American history, took place on September 5th as de Grasse's fleet sailed out to sea in the Chesapeake to meet and repel a British squadron that had been sent by General Clinton from New York. After the British were expelled, the British fleet was expelled. De Grasse urged Lafayette to force the issue with Cornwallis immediately so that he could resume his primary responsibility, which was the defense of the French West Indies. Lafayette, a prematurely mature 24-year-old, demurred. He would not spend the lives of his forces in a battle of equals when he knew that Washington and Rochambeau would arrive shortly with forces that would double the size of those now under his command. He also believed that his paternal friend Washington and General Rochambeau had earned the right to preside over what he believed was the final act of the American Revolution. On September 14, 1781, Washington and Rochambeau and their troops arrived at Williamsburg. The siege of Yorktown, essentially orchestrated by French engineers and powered by French artillery, began on September 17th. The last two fortifications, redoubts 9 and 10, fell on October 14th, the former stormed by French troops, the latter by American troops under Lafayette's overall command, with Alexander Hamilton commanding the troops. Yes, the code name was Rochambeau for this operation, and the troops were ordered to empty their muskets of ammunition, lest an accidental firing spoil the surprise, as in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, the musical. Surrender negotiations began on October 17th at the Moore House in Yorktown. The Allied commissioners were Colonel John Lawrence, a friend of Lafayette's and Hamilton's, as we know from the musical, who had also been involved in the taking of Redoubt 10, and Lafayette's brother-in-law, the Viscount de Noailles. When the British soldiers refused to look at the Americans on surrender field on October 19th, Lafayette ordered the American band to play Yankee Doodle. According to one account, the British were so thin-skinned at this pleasantry that many of them smashed their arms in anger while laying them down on the slope. The last major engagement of the American Revolution had ended with a magnificent Allied victory. The next slide is an engraving from the 1780s by a French engraver of Lafayette. It's not from, well, he may have seen Lafayette, but the scene is not from life. It was engraved in France. So between the American and French revolutions in the 1780s, Lafayette continued to act in support of American interests as he did for the rest of his life. During the 1780s in France, he played an important role in supporting American diplomacy, first with Franklin and later with Thomas Jefferson in 1785. When Lafayette visited Monticello in November of 1824, Jefferson took him to the University of Virginia. At an event in Lafayette's honor held in the Rotunda, Jefferson, who was frail, had a speech read for him that described Lafayette's role on behalf of American diplomacy, and which included the opening up of numerous French ports to American goods, which helped to save the whaling industry in Nantucket, as well as arranging for a contract between Nantucket whalers and the city of Paris to light all the street lamps in Paris with Nantucket whale oil.
Wow.
Like Jefferson said in this speech, quote, "I only held the nail, he drove it." In 1786, the people of Nantucket expressed their gratitude by dedicating 1 day's milk from every cow in the island to create a 500-pound cheese to send to Lafayette in France. The next slide is a children's book that appeared in 1950, and on the jacket it presents, or it repeats the town meeting in a Plymouth newspaper, which describes how this vote was taken. But someone, when I show this slide, tell this story, one of my listeners said sending cheese to a Frenchman in France is like sending coals to Newcastle.
Exactly.
I'm now going to turn to Lafayette's return visit, the farewell tour. First slide, please. Oh, there it goes. Nope, the other direction, yeah. Yes. In 1846, Ensigns and Thayer of New York published a colored broadside entitled Pictorial History of the United States. In addition to depicting the seals of each of the states and printed information about the discovery of America, the battles of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, population statistics from 1790 and 1840, and a list of distinguished men, the print contains images of three figures below the title. Washington in the middle, Franklin to his left, and Lafayette on his good right hand. The next slide is a close-up of the three images. Not Jefferson or Madison or Adams or Hamilton or even Jackson, who was very popular at this time, but a Frenchman, Lafayette. How did that happen? In the 19th century and into the 20th century, Lafayette's reputation in America was extraordinary. He was already popular before his arrival in 1824. He was popular by virtue of his important role in the American Revolution, which I just shared with you, his subsequent activities on behalf of his adopted land, his close friendship with Washington, and his storybook life. However, during this trip, in which he toured each of the 24 states and was treated as a conquering hero, his reputation was reaffirmed, and this trip elevated him to iconic status. The only analogies that I could think of for the excitement that was created when he visited a place is the Beatles tour in the 1960s or the visit of John Paul II in 1979. The result was that Lafayette's name was firmly imprinted on the American psyche. When state banks printed legal tender, Lafayette's face appeared on bills in more states than any other person except Washington. Scores of counties, cities, towns, and townships, 80 of them, were named for Lafayette. They take 6 forms: Lafayette, Fayette, Fayetteville, Lafayetteville, LaGrange, which was the name of the chateau that he lived in from 1799 to 1834, and even LaGrangeville, one LaGrangeville. This is, the next slide is a front view of the Chateau LaGrange, and the slide after that is the view of the back of the chateau. There are countless cities, streets, squares, and parks. There are 8 streets named for Lafayette in the city of Boston, and 10, actually, I had to rethink this. There are actually 12 in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Numerous statues and monuments were built. Daniel Chester French Lafayette Monument stands in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. That's my favorite. I grew up in Brooklyn. Daniel Chester French later did the Lincoln Memorial. After France gave America the Statue of Liberty, America decided to reciprocate. An equestrian statue of Lafayette by Paul Wayland Bartlett, an American expatriate, was given to France in 1908. It was called the Children's Statue because school children had raised the money to fund the statue. It stood outside the Louvre until the IMP pyramid was constructed, some say as a future set for the movie The Da Vinci Code, which event caused its removal to a spot on the right bank of the Seine. That's the very impressive children's statue. A copy of the children's statue sits behind the State House in Hartford, Connecticut, by the way. The next slide is Washington and Lafayette. In Lafayette Square, New York, at the southern tip of Morningside Park, and it was done by Bartholdi, the same sculptor who did the Statue of Liberty. Mount Lafayette was named by the good people of Franconia, New Hampshire in 1824. Lafayette College got its name from Lafayette's visit to Philadelphia in 1826. There's a Lake Lafayette in northern Florida and the Lafayette River in southern Virginia. Lafayette decided to return to America one last time after he received President James Monroe's invitation in early 1824. In July, he departed for America with his son, George Washington Lafayette, and Auguste Levasseur, his private secretary, who kept a journal of the trip, and a valet, and they came on an American packet ship called the Cadmus. This trip, the farewell tour, was a unique event in our history, if not the history of the world. You may think that what I just said is hyperbole. However, I'm not alone in expressing this opinion. In 1830, for example, Edward Everett wrote a review of Lafayette, America in 1820 or 1825, his Lafayette secretary first-hand account of the tour. And in this review, he praised the book, Lafayette, and the farewell tour. About the tour, he wrote, quote, "An event taken in all its parts unparalleled in the history of man. Here is this 67-year-old man, tall but somewhat portly, who walks with a limp and a cane and wears a hairpiece, who has wielded no, I guess there's no, I don't mean that pejoratively, but just factually, and who had held no political or military authority since 1792. And when he went to the defense of France on the northern border, who then held no public position, and he is treated like a conquering hero, like a Caesar or an Alexander, for 13 months in every corner of the country. There were parades, militia reviews, dinners, banquets, balls, meet and greets with school children, the public, and members of private societies. There were dedications of public monuments and buildings, and a plethora of speeches and toasts. Triumphal arches are built in many cities honoring Lafayette. But Americans of all races, each gender, and of every age wanted to touch this man who had done so much for their country. A whole cottage industry of consumer goods was created. There were Lafayette prints, fans, hats, buttons, bandanas, medallions, sheet music, bottles, brushes, baby shoes, ribbons. The next slide is a Lafayette ribbon worn by the school children of Boston when Lafayette arrived in 1825. There were scarves. The next slide is a Welcome Lafayette scarf created in Philadelphia in 1824. There was Staffordshire and other ceramics, including a set of dishes depicting Lafayette's arrival in New York City, and ladies' kid gloves with his face imprinted on them. Next slide are two examples of ladies' kid gloves. They actually, men wore them too, ladies and men's kid gloves. Numerous American painters wanted to paint Lafayette from life, and many did. The two most important ones are the New York and the Philadelphia paintings. That's Samuel Morse's Lafayette, which is now in the City Hall, New York. It's Lafayette with the busts of Washington and Franklin looking at an empty pedestal, which is waiting for his bust. And the next one is the Philadelphia painter Thomas Sully, Lafayette in front of Independence Hall. On August 15, 1824, the Cadmus arrived in New York Bay. The next slide is a painting of the Cadmus. It's in a museum in Maine from the time. As Levasseur contemplated Staten Island to his left, the noise of a cannon caught my attention from another side. It was the artillery of Fort Lafayette, which had been renamed in his honor, which is announcing the arrival of the Cadmus to the city of New York. Because it was a Sunday, Lafayette disembarked in Staten Island and stayed at the home of the then vice president, a man by the name of Daniel Tompkins. On the following day, he arrived at Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan on the Chancellor Livingston, which was a steamboat, accompanied by a numerous flotilla of boats, and was welcomed by all the military and civilian authorities of the city of New York, and a crowd, according to Levasseur, of over 100,000 people. The next slide is a 19th century painting which shows Castle Garden in the background, and the next slide is a ceramic, one of those Staffordshire plates showing the arrival of Lafayette at Castle Garden. And the next slide is an aerial. It looks like that today. It's part of Battery Park. It used to be out in the water, but all that land was filled in. Having been feted in New York City, Lafayette headed for Boston on August 20, 1824 on the Old Post Road. He arrived in Roxbury, a near suburb, a little after midnight on the 24th, having stopped in many cities in Connecticut and in Providence, Rhode Island. On the morning of the 24th, he headed to Boston from the Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury in a procession of 70,000 people. He crossed the Commons, the Boston Commons, to the State House, where he was addressed by the governor and replied. He was then escorted to apartments that the city alderman had prepared for him right at the corner of Park and Beacon Streets. The backstory to those apartments is told in a catalog called Rather Elegant and Showy, the Classical Furniture of Isaac Vos, because as the next slide shows, one of the pieces of furniture was this couch. There was an exhibit at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Well, Lafayette stayed at the Armory House from August 24th to his departure from Boston on September 2. And to summarize what the catalog says, the alderman rented a portion of the Armory House at 22 Beacon Street, which still exists, by the way, and gorgeously furnished it. As the authors write, the city of Boston hired only the most respected craftsmen for the furnishings. Vos and Sons for furniture and lighting, Hedges for an upholstery, draperies, and carpeting. Consistent with this high standard, they also selected the city's leading gilder and looking glass maker, John Doggett. He billed the city for a loan of 2 pairs of looking glasses, one pair valued at an extraordinary $425. The Vos furniture consisted of 78 items, including the beautiful rosewood couch. Mr. Doggett also provided 5 Gilbert Stuart paintings, one of each president, so that Lafayette could be with his friends. Moreover, they hired a barouche, an open carriage with 4 white horses for Lafayette's use. So in the afternoon, there was a dinner at the Exchange Tavern. According to the local press, Lafayette visited John Hancock's widow on that evening. This visit is memorialized in Louisa May Alcott's book, An Old-Fashioned Girl. While this is a work of fiction, the story has the ring of truth to it, and its veracity is supported by the familial relationship between Alcott's mother and Madame Hancock. In this story, a grandmother tells, I'm sure you know all this, but a grandmother tells Lafayette's visit to her grandchildren, tells about Lafayette's visit to her grandchildren and their friend. Well, by and by, the general, escorted by the mayor, that's Mayor Josiah Quincy, who was related to both Dorothy Hancock and also Louisa May Alcott's mother, drove up. Dear me, I see him now, a little old man in nankeen trousers and vest, a long blue coat and ruffled shirt, leaning on his cane, for he's lame, and smiling and bowing like a true Frenchman. As he approached, the 3 old ladies rose and curtsied with the utmost dignity. Lafayette bowed first to the governor's picture, then to the governor's widow, and kissed her hand. That was droll, for on the back of her glove was stamped Lafayette's likeness, and the gallant old gentleman kissed his own face. Then some of the young ladies were presented, and as if to escape any further self-salutations, the Marquis kissed the pretty girls on the cheek. Yes, my dears, here is just the spot where the dear old man saluted me. I'm quite as proud of it now as I was then, for he was a brave, good man, and he helped us in our trouble. The next slide is a glove which came down in Mayor Quincy's family. It belonged to one of his daughters who was probably present at Madame Hancock's that evening. So it's the type of glove that was available in Boston in 1824. While in Boston, Lafayette visited Harvard College, where Edward Everett addressed him, and his son George received an honorary degree. On the 29th, Lafayette visited John Adams in Quincy. On the 31st, he headed north, stopping in Chelsea, Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Ipswich, and Newburyport. He did that on the same day. It was a rainy day, but there were events in each place. Citizens of New Hampshire joined the frenzy surrounding Lafayette's visit on September 1, 1824 in Portsmouth. Although Lafayette proved to be a magnet for all Americans, more than the others, veterans of the American Revolution hastened to greet him. September 1 happened to be the day of Franklin Pierce's graduation from Bowdoin College. As Peter Wallner writes in his biography of New Hampshire's only president, Franklin had been selected to give an honorary oration in Latin and wrote his father, General Benjamin Pierce, hoping he would attend the ceremony. Wallner writes, in this he was disappointed, however, as the old general joined other Revolutionary War soldiers at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to honor General Lafayette, who was on his famous tour of the United States. So he dissed his son's graduation and valedictory address to spend some time with Lafayette. After visiting Portsmouth and returning to Boston, Lafayette headed west to Lexington, Concord, and Worcester on his way to New York City for his second visit there. In Lexington, a banner was hung on an evergreen on the green. This is the banner. It's a prized possession of the Historical Society. It's 39 feet long, 9 inches high. It's cloth with green paint. And that's what greeted Lafayette when he arrived in the town of Lexington. Lexington spent some time, Lafayette spent some time in New York City, and then he left again in late September and headed west through New Jersey to Philadelphia before heading southward. He arrived at Yorktown in time to celebrate Surrender Day on October 19th. He reached Monticello on November 4 and spent 10 days with Jefferson. Then he spent 4 days with Madison at his home in Montpelier. After spending most of the winter of 1824 in Washington City, he decided to accept the invitations of all the states he had not yet visited so that he could visit all 24 states. His original intent was to visit only the first 13 states. So on February 23rd, he headed south through Virginia, stopping at places in North Carolina and entered South Carolina. In Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, an incident occurred which encapsulates this man who made no distinctions of race, color, or creed. In many of the southern states, local jurisdictions had issued decrees forbidding African Americans, whether they were enslaved or free, from attending any of the public events. And the reason they did that was that Lafayette was a well-known abolitionist and his reputation had preceded him. In an autobiographical sketch of a Mr. Dr. Maurice Moore, who was a militiaman when Lafayette visited in 1825, the following incident is described. It takes place after the public parade and militia review. 2 sentinels with fixed bayonets, and it was at a private home where there was to be a reception. 2 sentinels with fixed bayonets on their guns were posted at the door to prevent the entrance of intruders. Here I saw a strange but pleasant incident transpire. An old African, neatly dressed, came to the front door and started in, but the sentinels interposed their bayoneted guns to his entrance. The old man contemptuously pushed them aside, saying, "Shaw, Shaw, see guns afore you was born." Been with him and shot by soldiers too, and without further opposition from anyone, gained his way. He came straight to the room where the distinguished guest was standing among the crowd and said, "I come to see General Lafayette." Lafayette turned, looked at him, and remarked, "An old acquaintance, don't tell me who it is." The Negro advanced to the marquis and, bowing, held out his hand and said, "Howdy, Master Lafayette. How do you do, sir? You remember me?" "Yes." "Yes. Stop, don't tell me your name." "Ah, I have it, Pompey, belonging to Colonel Buchanan, the first servant who waited on me when I came to America. When I landed at Georgetown, I was taken first to the camp of General Buchanan near there, and Pompey waited on me," said he, as he shook warmly the old man's hand. The nobleman called for a glass of champagne with Pompey, which that worthy took with great dignity, and he put out his hand and said, "Goodbye, Master Lafayette, we getting old, we'll never meet again, God bless you." They shook hands again. Pompey went out, mounted his pony, and started for his home near Winnsboro, saying he'd come to see General Lafayette. Now he'd done that, he was going home. After Lafayette's southern and western tours, he returned to Boston for the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. Daniel Webster gave the address. It's called his first Bunker Hill address because when the monument was finished, he gave a second. In his oration, he addressed Lafayette, who was sitting in front of the Revolutionary War veterans who were present on an armchair. And one of the things he said is, "Heaven saw fit that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted by you from the new world to the old." After Bunker Hill, Lafayette made a second trip to New Hampshire and then headed east to Maine and went back to Concord and west to Vermont. Vermont was the 24th state that he actually visited. The next slide is a basket wagon belonging to Dr. Leonard Jarvis. It's in the collection of the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook. And that's the wagon that took him from Claremont, New Hampshire, to the bridge in Cornish, the Windsor Bridge, on June 28, 1825. After Vermont, Lafayette traveled back to New York City. As he left New York City on July 14th, a militia unit which had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette's and his service in the Parisian National Guard in the French Revolution, saw him off. By the end of the 19th century, now the next slide is that's a poster made from a painting commissioned by the National Guard in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. But the legend of that poster, which doesn't appear on the slide, reports that by the end of the 19th century, thank you. Brought my own, as an attorney, every time I gave a closing argument, my nose started to run. So but thank you, you're great. I should have remembered that. So every state militia had renamed itself National Guard in honor of Lafayette. That's why it's called the National Guard today. Like Churchill in World War II, Lafayette lived in the White House in August and September of 1825 with John Quincy Adams, who was an old friend of his. On September 7th, 1825, President Adams sent Lafayette off aboard a new, recently constructed frigate that was named the Brandywine in honor of Lafayette's service in the Battle of the Brandywine, where he was wounded. I don't know if that's the greatest name for that vessel to take Lafayette home. In his journal, Levasseur, Lafayette's private secretary, chronicles Lafayette's visits to his old friends, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, and his new friend, who Lafayette met at a boarding house in Washington, D.C., Andrew Jackson. And through Levasseur's eyes, we get glimpses of the characters of these early American leaders. Jefferson is the ever-gracious host. Levasseur comments on the good appearance and cheerfulness of the Negroes of Monticello as attesting to, quote, the humanity of their master, but elsewhere, immediately after, in fact, describes slavery as a crime against humanity and advocates for the education of blacks and gradual emancipation, which was parroting Lafayette's own views. At Jackson's home in Tennessee, Lafayette is shown pistols that he had given Washington in 1778 and now belonged to Jackson. They had been given to Jackson by a descendant of George Washington a few years earlier. When Lafayette recognizes them and comments that, quote, he felt true satisfaction in finding them in the hands of a man so worthy of such a legacy, Jackson blushes and his eye gleams as on a day of victory. My favorite story in the book takes place on August 6, 1825. Lafayette comes down for breakfast at the White House. He tells President Adams, I'd like to visit your predecessor, James Monroe. And Adams was very close to James Monroe. He said, all right, well, I'll get a party together. So he got 3 carriages together. It was a party of about 8 or 9, and they had to cross the Potomac. And it was a toll bridge, and the toll taker asked for the toll. President Adams paid it. So they get to the other side of the bridge and they hear a noise behind them. It's the toll taker. Mr. President, you're 11 cents short. So this scene takes place where the toll taker is there and the president comes out and they're pointing at how many people, because it depended on how many carriages and how many passengers. And during this process, the toll taker recognizes Lafayette, who he calls the nation's guest. And he says, which was his, people called him that, I'm not going to take a toll for the nation's guest. And President Adams says, no, I insist. Let's continue the counting. This is not a public function. We're on a private mission to visit a friend. So they continue to count. Sure enough, he's 11 cents short. The president hands over another 11 cents. And Levasseur writes that it is ironic that the only time during this 13-month trip that a toll was paid for Lafayette was in the presence of the head of state, a circumstance which in any other country would have surely conferred immunity on him. While in America, Lafayette was the first foreigner to address a joint session of Congress, and he was addressed in turn by Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who called him a faithful and fearless champion of liberty. Congress voted Lafayette a national reward of $200,000 and 23 acres of land, a township in northern Florida, right near Tallahassee. He was that was a lot of money, $200,000, and Congress never did that. That was like a first, to give a private citizen an award like that. He was one of the earliest travelers on the Erie Canal in 1825 as he returned from the west to Boston. Lafayette died on May 20, 1834, and was buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris, and soil from Bunker Hill was sprinkled over his grave. President Jackson gave Lafayette the same military honors as John Adams had given to Washington on his death. America mourned. There were eulogies in churches, in state legislatures, and private societies. On December 31st, 1834, John Quincy Adams gave the official eulogy of the United States in a joint session of Congress. I will end this talk with an obituary, not of Lafayette, but of an obscure Philadelphian by the name of David Kramer. Now, Mr. Kramer died in Philadelphia during the blizzard of 1888. He didn't die because of the blizzard, he died of disease. But anyhow, the obituary, which was published in all caps, it says, a man who knew Lafayette dead. David Kramer died on Monday evening, the 12th, after several months' illness of a complication of diseases in the 73rd year of his age. So if you do the math, we can all maybe do mental math. 73 from 88, he was born in 1815. He, many years ago, resided in Philadelphia, where he was a contractor and erected many fancy buildings for the leading men of that city. He was a member of the F and AM, the Freemasons, Carpenters Association, which was a high-end guild, and the Oddfellows, and at one time was an active member of the city council. In his youth, and here's the punchline, in his youth, he had the pleasure of seeing and conversing with General Lafayette during his last visit to America. Well, if you do the math, David Kramer, a successful builder, city councilor, and joiner, was 9 years old, went along with 5,000 other school children. 70 schools with about 70 children each came to see Lafayette at Independence Hall on October 4th, 1824, when he arrived in Philadelphia. And that was apparently the most important event of his life. Gives you an idea of the impact that this man had. Thank you. You are a dear. You are a dear.
Okay, I think we're going to have a lot of questions. Bob, where are you? Grab a mic. Do you have it? Okay. Let me just remind everyone. Look at this tome. I want to remind everyone that Levasseur, the secretary, wrote the original book in French, Lafayette in America. Our friend, Mr. Hoffman, spent 2 years translating the book into English. I mean, is that a labor of love? And this is Alan's book in English, Lafayette in America. And it is the complete record of everything that Alan just talked about. So there are signed copies of the book available here for purchase should anyone would like to acquire a copy of the book. All right, we're ready for questions. Who would like to be first? So, Bill, you are.
I can
wait.
make an announcement.
No, you hang on, you need to speak into the mic for the Zoom audience.
I'd like to make an announcement. On September 2nd of next year, there will be a reenactment of Lafayette's arrival here in Lexington. And I hope you put that on your calendars.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next question.
Yes,
Nope, sorry, hang on, Marion.
Mundane. Was Lafayette married?
yes, yes,
Did he leave any heirs?
yes.
And where was his wife during this visit?
His wife had died in about 1808. She was a remarkable woman in her own right. They married when she was 14 and he was 16. And they had 3 surviving children. And when he... Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, they had 3 surviving children. And when he...
Something's wrong.
Did this go off?
Susan rescued you.
Here,
Nope, I put it, it
you
worked
want to
during
use
the...
this one, we can switch.
Oh, okay.
Here we go.
Testing, can you hear me? Okay, the question was, did Lafayette have a wife and did they have children? So his wife, her name was Adrienne de Noailles. She was 14 and he was 16 when they were married. It was an arranged marriage, but it was a very loving marriage. And he was in prison for 5 years. When the Jacobins took power, he was a general on the Northern Front defending France from the emigres and the monarchies. England, mostly England, Austria, and Prussia. And he went over the border. He thought he would get to England and America, but he was arrested and he spent 5 years in prison. She had her own adventures about being in prison in France, and 3 of her very closest relatives were executed by the Jacobins on the same day, her mother, grandmother, and older sister. But after she got out of prison with the help of Ambassador James Monroe and his wife, who was in France at the time, she had found out what prison he was in. So she traveled to Austria and went to see the Emperor of Austria, who was not very fond of Lafayette because he blamed Lafayette for his aunt's death, Marie Antoinette. But anyhow, he said, you can join him in prison, but if you go in there, you're not coming out. So she and her 2 daughters joined him in prison, and they spent about almost 2 years with him. And then Napoleon overran most of Europe, and one of the terms of the Treaty of Campio was that all the political prisoners, including Lafayette, would be released. So that's how he got out of prison. He was in exile in Danish Holstein and Holland. Napoleon didn't want him either. He saw him as somewhat of a threat. But ultimately, his wife and he went back to France, and he became a gentleman farmer at Lagrange. There are descendants today from those 3 children. His son's name was George Washington Lafayette. Yes.
Anyone over here?
Next.
Then I'll have a question.
He answered my question before I even asked it.
Oh, my goodness. I'm on my game.
So the question is on the tie between the victory, the American victory in Saratoga and the Treaty of Paris where Franklin was. Is that the tie in the Treaty of Paris because Franklin was there in Paris? Is that where Lafayette got the urge to help us out, or was it, what was the tie between the observation of the first major victory at Saratoga
Yeah. Lafayette, when you say the Treaty of Paris, you're talking about the initial Treaty of Paris in 1778, correct? When France decided to join, not the final treaty when the war ended, that would be 70, right. Okay, so Lafayette, if I'm not mistaken, Lafayette, that was not his initial impetus. His initial impetus, as he describes in his memoir, was a dinner party in Metz in August of 1775, when the younger brother of King George III was visiting Europe, and he stopped at the headquarters of Lafayette's, the regiment that Lafayette was a part of, and the commander held a dinner party. And he was the Duke of Gloucester, and he was very opposed to his brother's policies. And during this dinner party, Lafayette says, is when he first decided to make the cause of America his cause. Now, that was August of 1775. I'm pretty sure it's before the Battle of Saratoga, right? So that was his impetus.
All right, I think we have a call, we have a question from our Zoom audience. Susan.
Yes, so this is from Francis, and they say, thank you, excellent presentation. What was Lafayette's reason or interest in joining the revolution at such a young age? And were there any other young French people that joined up so early on?
Historians have debated what his initial motivation is. One historian, and I don't agree with it, said he was a bored teenager and he wanted adventure. I like to think that he was an Enlightenment man. He had a classical education. He studied the Roman Republic, and that he was inspired by the American Revolution and what the Americans were fighting for. So one of the reasons I feel this way, and the same historian kind of left this out of his account of the letter that Lafayette wrote to his wife aboard the ship. By the way, he did 3 things aboard the ship. He learned how to speak English with his comrade Baron de Kalb, who was fluent in English. He studied military history because he'd never participated in a battle, and everything he knew was theoretically, and he was horribly seasick. That's what he did over this 2-month voyage. But he wrote a letter, he found time to write this long letter to his wife, in which he wrote that the cause of America is the cause of all mankind. It is destined to be the asylum for peace, liberty, et cetera, et cetera. So I think he was imbued with those Enlightenment ideas before he came. He certainly wanted to have adventure as well. Yeah. Yes?
No, wait, just a sec.
It's my understanding that Lafayette, in the course of the French Revolution, sacrifices a great deal, suffers a great deal, his family, his in-laws.
Right next to you.
Oh, okay.
So in the course of the French Revolution, Lafayette does sacrifice a great deal, suffers a great deal, especially in terms of his wife's relatives having been guillotined. And he spends the 5 years in prison, etc. He goes on, though, even after all of that, and after all of what he had given to us during the course of our American Revolution, he never loses his optimism, his desire to bring reform to the French people in the form of a constitutional monarchy. To his dying day, he fought for that, struggled for that. So my question is more about the French people here. Why do they treat his memory as dismissively as I understand that they do?
Yeah. Well, I think you can think of it this way. The French historiography is either dominated by the left or the right, and they both hated him. Yeah. The right blamed him for the French Revolution. The left called him a traitor. In fact, in 2000, President Sarkozy loved Lafayette. I think he even wrote a book about Lafayette. And in 2007, he floated a proposal to have Lafayette's remains taken from his tomb at Peak Cemetery and put it in this big national tomb where a lot of other French heroes are. And of course, the family didn't want it, but it got vitriolic criticism. I saw a op-ed in one of the French newspapers written by someone from the left who called him a traitor. How could we even consider this? He was a traitor to the French Revolution. He went over the border. Well, he went over the border because you were going to kill him. But that's how they think. But fortunately, or fortuitously, there have been a couple of recent biographies which are much more measured and complimentary. In fact, we're trying to get one translated, but a man by the name of Laurent Zucchini, like zucchini, except it's Z-C-C-H-I-N-I. I saw him speak, and he was very good about Lafayette. But most French biographies are horrible from one side or the other in terms of treating him fairly, in my opinion, anyway.
I've got a question.
Yes.
And that, maybe we could do a little more detail about Lafayette's visit to Lexington in 1824, because that was a big deal here in Lexington. And maybe you could talk about it in more detail, or I don't want to put Bill Poole on the spot, but we know the Historical Society knows a lot about the visit. And I'm just wondering, how much do you know, Bill? Do you want to talk about it?
Great.
I really do not. However, I would ask you to remember that on September 2nd, there's a wonderful reenactment here. We'll have a terrific individual who portrays Lafayette come here. There'll be ceremonies and so forth. We may even have the banner hung at that you saw before. So it's going to be a wonderful thing. And I want to say one thing about French behavior towards Lafayette. The Germans admired Lafayette more than the French did, because during World War II, they allowed the American flag to fly over Lafayette's grave the entire time in honor of Lafayette. Now, that was the only time you could see anything like that happen. They did respect him, and I think a lot of other countries who had revolutions that took place after that, like Poland and Hungary and so forth, they all admired Lafayette, and they looked to him as an exemplar of liberty and freedom, the rights of man and so forth, and he dedicated, as you said, his entire life to that. And I was privileged enough to say a speech at his grave at Peacock, which was a highlight of my career. Thank you.
There you go.
Well, glad we spoke.
Can I just follow up?
Yes,
one
please
moment,
do.
and then we'll go. So he came to, as we said, he came to Lexington Green, and he was greeted by about 6 or 7 survivors who were on the green, the militiamen, in 1775. It was a very moving scene. And Levasseur talks about the obelisk. That obelisk there is the oldest, I believe, and maybe the veterans can correct me, it's the oldest military monument in the country. And it was there in 1824. And because it was an obelisk, Levasseur thought it was a grave of these men. At that time, apparently it wasn't, but later on, they were actually interred next to the obelisk. So he was ahead of his time, but he thought they were all buried there, the ones who died. Yeah.
Good point.
Yes?
I just wanted to comment. I had read the Lexington Historical Proceedings that was done in the late 1800s. So I don't know how accurate it is. It's probably based on folklore. But there was a mention of Lafayette being in Lexington at the obelisk. And it was quite a ceremony honoring those who had died. And there were 14 veterans there at the time.
Yes.
And they hung on every word he said, you know. So I'm hoping that's true.
Can you get me a copy of that? Like just scan in the page
Oh,
or something?
scan it, sure. Because I have it.
You have that? Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to see that, yeah. All right.
I think we have another question from our Zoom audience.
Yep, so this is from Gerard. Is it a fact or myth that General Pershing landing in France during World War I said, "Lafayette, I am here"?
Well, not actually, that statement was made on July 4th, 1917 at Peacock Cemetery in front of Lafayette's grave. And it was said by General Pershing's aide, a man by the name of Colonel Charles Stanton. And I've read Pershing's 2-volume, what would you call it, memoir, My Experiences in the War, and he totally gives Colonel Stanton the credit for saying that. And I have also seen at Lafayette College, there was a professor who was very interested in that in the 30s, and Pershing was still alive. And he got copies, which he put in the file, and I've seen them, of Stanton's speech, handwritten. It was a very short speech, with the notation of approval by General Pershing, Pershing's initials. So I have no doubt that Colonel Stanton said it at that time.
We have tried to stump him at every and we have not succeeded. He knows everything. All right, Edith, here you go. Just one sec.
Well, just a short question. Did General Patton address the French in French and recognize Lafayette?
Patton or Pershing? Are you thinking?
No, I'm talking about Patton.
World War II? You stumped me on that one.
Sorry about that.
I don't know.
Well, General Patton spoke French fluently, I understand. And when I think he was sort of initially disgraced because of the incident of hitting a private, he was sent around to make speeches. And I understand in one speech he acknowledged I think, Pierre Natal de Lafayette.
Ooh, I'd love to see that. I haven't seen that.
Okay, I'll try to get that.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
Okay. Any more from Zoom? All right. We can do 1, 2 more questions. Behind me. No, don't talk.
In September of 2018, I had the privileged opportunity to travel to France for 2.5 weeks, and one of my places to visit was the Picpus Cemetery. And I stood there, in front of his grave, and wondering, why is this man and his wife buried in such a kind of a, I'm sorry, but I used the term nondescript place, behind because I'd seen a lot of cathedrals by then, behind a nondescript church. And finally figured that out. And I was wondering, would you mind sharing that with?
Sure. So, as I said, 3 of Adrienne's relatives were beheaded in the month before Robespierre fell, June, July of 1794. And they were thrown with 13 others in a pit near where it used to be called it still is called the Place de la Nation, is where it was, which is near where Picpus Cemetery is. So when and the French, being good record keepers, they know exactly the names of all these people. So when Adrienne came back, she preceded Lafayette in 1799. She wanted to honor her parents, and her mother and sister and grandmother. And she and a surviving sister went around and took up a subscription to build a cemetery next to the pit where those 1,300 lay. And they induced an order of Ursuline nuns to come and live there and pray in this chapel once a year for the victims of Picpus. That's what they call them, the victims of Picpus. So if you go to the chapel, if you visit the cemetery, on the wall there's 1,300 names of the people who are in the pit. So I think it was Adrienne's motive was to be buried near her family. Yes?
I can just shout it out. In terms of today's money, how much did he inherit when he was a kid?
Ooh. I don't know that figure, but one figure I do know, when he got $200,000 in 1824, in 2015 dollars, that was worth $3.5 million. So it was a major gift to him. But I don't know the answer to your
Lush, but not overly ostentatious.
He received land in northern Florida. Did he ever occupy it, or what did he do with the land?
He gave a quarter of it to the city of Tallahassee. It's part of Tallahassee. That's why there's a lake down there, Lake Lafayette. And the rest, it's not clear what happened. He never occupied it. He probably sold it for not a huge amount of money. Yeah.
Well, I think that is a wonderful wrap-up to our program. Please join me in giving a big thank you to Alan Hoffman. What a wonderful way to recognize patriots. Thank you so much.